Life is only suffering. Born in 1788, Arthur Schopenhauer was a German philosopher who took pessimism to another level. Focusing on life's suffering, plights, dark sides, and human struggles, his concepts about life and the purpose of life were so dark and unsettling that he called life an unnecessary suffering, where moments of pleasure are fleeting. He said that life was created without any purpose, and everyone in the world lives under the influence of a force he calls will to live. When a human's desires are unmet, this blind force provokes him to struggle to pursue pleasure. But this inevitably leads to more pain. Schopenhauer had a privileged background as his father was a prosperous merchant and his mother was a prominent author. She became one of the first German women to publish books without using a pseudonym. Despite being destined for a career in his father's mercantile footsteps, Schopenhauer's life took a different turn after his father's tragic death in 1805, suspected to be a suicide following a period of depression. Schopenhauer openly acknowledged inheriting his father's melancholy, and his relationship with his mother was strained, with his happiest childhood moments occurring when away from her. This challenging upbringing left Schopenhauer with a general distrust of people, a pessimistic worldview, and difficulties forming close relationships, compounded by personal insecurities manifesting as anxiety attacks, phobias, and hypochondria. Saying his own suffering and the purposelessness of life, Arthur would think why life existed in the first place. Why were species like humans created and sent to the earth, where the deepest sufferings awaited them? Arthur now had the time to think about these questions and changed philosophy forever. Liberated from the demands of commercial life, he threw himself into academic pursuits. Schopenhauer demonstrated exceptional progress by engaging in private lessons and attending lectures across various disciplines such as medicine, philosophy, mathematics, history, physics, and astronomy. Tutors foresaw a distinguished future for him as a classical scholar. Fluent in German, English, French, Italian, Spanish, Latin, and ancient Greek, he showcased his linguistic prowess. However, in 1813, Schopenhauer isolated himself in the countryside to work on his doctoral thesis. On the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason, this thesis laid the groundwork for the philosophical principle that everything has a reason, shaping our understanding of the world of representation, a central theme in his later works. However, Schopenhauer's passion for academic philosophy dwindled as he became disillusioned with the emphasis on abstractions and generalizations rather than lived experience. He argued that academic philosophers approached problems conceptually, while true philosophers engaged with them existentially through an involuntary reflection on their own existence and experiences. Schopenhauer's life's work aimed to be distinguished by a commitment to lived experience over abstract theorizing. That's the reason Schopenhauer's writing stands apart from the sterile and academic German of his time. It is direct, conversational, concrete, and brimming with metaphors and anecdotes. This was the time when Schopenhauer was studying Hinduism and Buddhism, revealing an undiscovered land of thought. He developed a profound affection for the Latin translation of the Upanishads, which are Vedic and post-Vedic Sanskrit texts that document the transition from the archaic ritualism of the Veda into new religious ideas and institutions. He expressed, "It is the most rewarding and elevating reading possible in the whole world. It has been the consolation of my life, and will be that of my death." In 1821, Schopenhauer had a confrontation with his neighbor. Reportedly aware of his wealth, the woman faked falling down the stairs and accused Schopenhauer. She took him to court and emerged victorious, compelling Schopenhauer to pay her a pension for the remaining 20 years of her life. Upon her death, Schopenhauer victoriously noted in his journals, "The old woman dies, the burden is lifted." Here, we see a more cynical and dark side of Arthur, who is not shy of expressing his inner feelings, no matter how cold they are. In 1818, he wrote one of the most famous works, The World as Will and Representation, at the age of 30. The second edition, unveiled in 1844, just a year before his death, incorporated an edited version of the first edition and additional commentary on his ideas. Much of his later writings enriched the work he wrote in his 20s, merging into a unified body of thought best understood as a single, organic whole. This masterwork holds Schopenhauer's comprehensive philosophy surrounding epistemology, metaphysics, aesthetics, and ethics. Its presentation and structure are lucidly divided into 4 parts. Schopenhauer asserted that his work aimed to convey a single thought, urging a meticulous study of the book to fathom the connection of each part to the other. Despite his conviction that he had unraveled the fundamental problems of philosophy in his masterpiece, the work went largely unnoticed, unsold, unreviewed, and unread. This neglect persisted throughout his life, becoming a prominent feature of his experience, alongside maternal rejection, contributing to his profound pessimism. In contrast, Hegel, a contemporary of Schopenhauer, basked in celebrity status, drawing large crowds at the University of Berlin. Hegel conceptualized a world unfolding through the spirit of the world, or Geist, across time. At every juncture in the world's spiritual history, internal contradictions to the zeitgeist emerged, necessitating resolution through a dialogue between opposing ideas, ultimately progressing towards a final perfection, the complete realization of the spirit in history. In other words, conflicting elements in life and within oneself collide and form a final entity that is more neutralized. However, despite this, it has conflicting elements, so the process continues. In contrast, Schopenhauer dismissed Hegel as an impostor, condemning the dense terminology and obscurity as a cover for vacuous ideas. He disputed the idea that absolute knowledge could be achieved through reason and rejected the notion of gradual perfection over time. Schopenhauer attempted to impart his contrasting ideas at the University of Berlin, while Hegel lectured, but the endeavor proved disastrous. Attendance was minimal. Frustrated, he departed from his university position shortly after that. In 1851, Schopenhauer released Parerga and Paralipomena in 2 volumes, supplemental essays to his primary work. He regarded this publication as the birth of his last child, symbolizing the fulfillment of his mission in the world. While the unconventional titles of Schopenhauer's books might have contributed to his limited popularity, Parerga and Paralipomena became his first successful and widely read book, partly due to positive reviews from his disciples. Despite gaining some popularity, Schopenhauer preferred a solitary existence. His routine included early morning wake-ups, reading until noon, playing his flute, having lunch at the same place, and taking extended walks with his poodles, all named Atman after the Sanskrit word for true self. He cherished his poodles more than anyone, and concluded his day by reading a few lines from the Upanishads before bedtime. Schopenhauer's life can be described as melancholy, prolonged, and isolated. In 1860, at the age of 72, he had breakfast seemingly in good health, but was later discovered dead while still seated at the table. That's when the world came to realize what a philosopher it had lost. His works then resurfaced, and people came to know what Arthur Schopenhauer was. The world as will and representation starts with Schopenhauer's declaration, "The world is my idea, a truth applicable to all that lives and knows, though only man can bring it into reflective and abstract consciousness." This doesn't mean the world is merely a product of our imagination or an illusion. Instead, it proposes that our individual minds influence our perception and encounter with the world. Each person has a unique way of sensing, interpreting, and engaging with the world. Schopenhauer said that our minds are not passive receptors of information from the external world. Rather, they actively construct and interpret it through our senses, intellect, and emotions. Although he said "my idea," Schopenhauer intended it to include all living beings with some level of consciousness and perception. He contended that even animals experience the world through their own filters and interpretations. Arthur said that humans, unlike other living entities, possess the ability for metacognition. We can not only undergo the world, but also contemplate how we undergo it. We can engage in abstract thinking about our own perceptions, scrutinize them, and even question their reality. Schopenhauer embarked on the ambitious task of constructing a comprehensive and unified interpretation of human experience, driven by the aim to uncover the underlying force of reality. This force, as Schopenhauer termed it, was the will, also referred to as the will to live or will to live, showing the essence of existence. Influenced by Kant, Schopenhauer shared the belief that the external world and its objects are mere representations. Our minds construct the realities we perceive, forming ideas. This resonates with Kant's idealism, where thoughts constitute our entire understanding, underscoring that sense perception doesn't provide direct access to the world. It's similar to Descartes' mind-body split embodied in the famous phrase, "I think, therefore I am." Schopenhauer, however, went beyond pure thinking, rejecting the notion of a mere brain in a jar. He identified a facet of the world not solely presented to us as representation, the one object we inhabit in space and time with which we share a direct relationship, our body. Termed the principle of individuation, this concept represents our mode of cognition of the phenomenal world and signifies the uniqueness of each individual. Paradoxically, this uniqueness becomes a barrier as the individual is an illusion, an outward manifestation of our true and innermost being, the will, connecting us with the entire world. Drawing on Plato's allegory of the cave, Schopenhauer stressed the importance of acknowledging this truth. He likened individuals who fail to recognize the illusory nature of people and things to those sitting in a dark cave, perceiving only shadows on the wall cast by a fire behind them. According to Schopenhauer, these shadows are mere illusions. At the same time, the real archetypes, the eternal ideas and original forms of all things, possess true beings because they exist perpetually, never undergoing change or passing away. Schopenhauer argued that those who haven't viewed people and things as occasional phantoms or illusions lack the capacity for philosophy. He argued that an unchangeable being is ever present, pursuing the same ends today as it did yesterday and always will. In his philosophical framework, the true symbol of nature is the circle, symbolizing continuity and constancy. Drawing from this insight, Schopenhauer infers that the fundamental force underlying every representation and the entirety of the world is the will. Yet, this may introduce some confusion, given that the term will often suggests a personality with a specific purpose. Schopenhauer's philosophy includes not only our individual will, but also extends to animals, trees, stones, and the entire cosmos. Schopenhauer's concept of will can be grasped as a force or energy, representing the thing in itself. While Kant proposed that the thing in itself was a domain beyond human reach, Schopenhauer believed it to be at the very core of existence. The will, as described by Schopenhauer, is not rational, conscious, or intentional. Instead, it manifests as an irrational, unconscious, and blind desire that ceaselessly seeks more activity. This insight sets Schopenhauer apart from his predecessors. The will is likened to a tornado swirling within us, propelling us from one state to another, and it serves as the source of our insatiable appetite, leading to strife and misery. According to Schopenhauer, existence is marked by unrest, with the will representing a war of all against all, an embodiment of proto-Darwinian thought. Well before Freud's psychoanalysis, Schopenhauer argued that much of our inner life remains veiled from us. Our actions, decisions, and speech are largely unconsciously motivated by our drives, rendering our complete inner selves unknowable. In other words, Schopenhauer says that the world comprises two interconnected aspects, like two sides of the same coin, a world of representation shaped by our minds, and a will as the irrational, blind force at the core of existence. In Schopenhauer's philosophical framework, the world is both will and representation. He stresses that finding the secret of reality doesn't start by scrutinizing matter first, and then progressing to thought. Rather, it starts with what we know directly and intimately, ourselves. Schopenhauer says that we see already that we can never arrive at the real nature of things from without. However much we investigate, we can never reach anything but images and names. Humans are like a man futilely circling a castle, desperately searching for an entrance and occasionally sketching the facades. Yet, Schopenhauer says this method has been the approach of all philosophers before me. When scrutinizing the external world, the conventional life narrative involves studying, graduating, securing a job, getting married, having kids, working, and theoretically living happily ever after. However, the stark reality is that happiness ever after remains elusive. At best, one desire is momentarily satisfied and swiftly replaced by another, an unending pursuit with no ultimate satisfaction. We exist as objects in the torrential stream of desire, carried along by the will like a leaf in a tumultuous river. Schopenhauer draws on the Greek myth of Ixion, bound to an ever-spinning winged fiery wheel for eternity, to illustrate the restless will. Although it may seem that we are guided by what we see, Schopenhauer argues that we are propelled by what we feel, by our unconscious will. Schopenhauer says that men are only apparently drawn from in front. In reality, they are pushed from behind. It is not the life that tempts them forward, but a necessity that drives them. To grasp reality, Schopenhauer urges us to surpass the notion of man as a rational animal and transcend the intellect, going into the unconscious will, which he describes as the strong blind man who carries on his shoulders the lame man who can see. In this perspective, the will holds superiority over the intellect. Schopenhauer illustrates the instinctual impulse through an anecdote of an elephant experienced in traversing numerous bridges, refusing to cross a fragile one. This instinctual impulse underscores the will's innate drive for survival and maximum life, with death as its ultimate adversary. Schopenhauer suggests that the most potent form of the will to live is the will to reproduce. In contrast to the belief that marriage and having children lead to happiness, Schopenhauer argues that the will to live unconsciously compels us to fulfill the will to reproduce for the propagation of the species. According to him, falling in love is an unconscious manipulation by the will seeking to create balanced children. He writes, "Each seeks a mate that will neutralize his defects, lest they be inherited. A physically weak man will seek a strong woman. Each one will regard as beautiful in another individual those perfections which he himself lacks. Nay, even those imperfections which are the opposite of his own. The sexual impulse functions as the inner life of the tree, symbolizing the species upon which the life of the individual flourishes." Schopenhauer explored this concept well before Freud's sexuality theory, leaving Freud astounded upon encountering his writings. In Schopenhauer's perspective, reproduction stands as the zenith. Once achieved, the individual's life gradually descends, while a new life ensures the endurance of the species, perpetuating the same cycle. He says that the alteration of death and reproduction is the pulse beat of the species. Death is for the species, what sleep is for the individual. This is nature's great doctrine of immortality. Yet, if the world is fundamentally will, it must inherently be a world of suffering. For every fulfilled wish, 10 others remain unmet. Schopenhauer perceives the world as inherently evil because pain serves as its basic stimulus and reality. Pleasure, he argues, is merely a negative cessation of pain. As soon as suffering ceases, boredom sets in, essentially leading to more suffering. Boredom is nothing but the sensation of the emptiness of existence. Suffering, according to Schopenhauer, is not the cry of the individual, it is the cry of existence itself. Most of our suffering lies in anticipation. Pain itself is brief. The thought of death, Schopenhauer notes, causes much more suffering than death itself. Schopenhauer depicts humans as hedgehogs clustering together for warmth in winter, uncomfortable when too closely packed, as we are stung by our spikes, and yet miserable when kept apart as we freeze. Every action leads to pain and suffering, a subtle form of discomfort and disturbance. The life of every individual, if we survey it as a whole, is genuinely a tragedy, but gone through in detail, it has the character of a comedy. Optimism is a bitter mockery of our woes. For Schopenhauer, death is the mirror image of the prior abyss. Life smiles at death and laughs at suicide. For every deliberate death, there are thousands of indeliberate births. As a rule, it will be found that as soon as the terrors of life outweigh the terrors of death, a man will put an end to his life. Schopenhauer acknowledged that compassion should be extended to suicide, saying, "Who hasn't had acquaintances, friends, or relatives who have voluntarily departed this world? And is everyone supposed to think of them with revulsion, as criminals? I say no and no again." However, he himself did not endorse suicide, as it denies life's pains, differing from the ascetic's renunciation of the will, which denies life's pleasures. The only form of self-destruction he deemed acceptable was the ascetic's death by starvation, where the individual will to live is mastered. Schopenhauer's pessimistic philosophy is undeniably sad, but it led him on a quest for tranquility and peace of mind. He proposed several alternatives: the denial of the will through asceticism or through the wisdom of life, aesthetics, and ethics. Schopenhauer quotes the French writer Schopenhauer, who stated, "It is difficult to find happiness within oneself, but it is impossible to find it anywhere else." To know oneself is a perennial philosophical reflection, where one discovers not only one's essence, but also the essence of the universe. In his youth, Schopenhauer despised theologians and labeled religion as the metaphysics of the masses, recognizing how the church indoctrinated the minds of young children. However, in later years, he began to see profound significance in certain religious practices. He believed that Christianity is a profound philosophy of pessimism. The doctrine of original sin, which he called assertion of the will, and of salvation, which he called denial of the will, is the great truth that constitutes the essence of Christianity. However, Schopenhauer considered Buddhism and Hinduism more profound than Christianity. Buddhists make the destruction of the will the entirety of religion. Hindus recognize the ego as an illusion, blinded by Maya. Transcending the ego leads to the Atman, the true self, whose goal is to merge with Brahman, the ultimate reality of existence, the source of the most profound self-knowledge. One way to escape suffering is to wage an inner war against the will to live, to cease desiring. However, the denial of the will ultimately leads to death. There is no salvation, enlightenment, or other meaningless words, but simply nothing. One of the ways out of the endless striving of the will is the intelligent contemplation of life through philosophy. Schopenhauer tells us that genius is the power to leave one's own interests, wishes, and aims entirely out of sight. The secret of genius lies in the clear and impartial perception of the objective, the essential, and the universal. While the intellect exists only to serve the will, in certain cases, the intellect is so disproportionately large that it far exceeds the amount needed to serve the will. In such individuals, the intellect can break free of the will and act independently, though only briefly. This will-less activity is aesthetic contemplation or creation, which Schopenhauer believes is the hallmark of genius. However, the genius cannot socialize with others who think of the temporary, the specific, and the immediate. Their inner poverty makes people sociable, which leads to external poverty. Human beings are unable to bear solitude because the inner emptiness drives them to society. However, the genius is forced into isolation and sometimes into madness. The more intelligent one is, the more pain one has. The person who is gifted with genius suffers most of all.